You're listening to 360 Digital, a podcast brought to you by Opinion's all-in-one user feedback software. This podcast series tackles a number of different topics under the digital umbrella, from best practices in UX and CRO to the latest trends and innovations in customer experience and digital marketing. This is 360 Digital. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of 360 Digital. My name is Erin Gilliam, and I'm here with my co-host, Luke Price. As you all know, last month we kicked off the series with our very first episode. We were interviewing Laura Klein, which is a UX expert and principal at Users Know. We had a really nice talk with her about qualitative and quantitative data and how enterprises can combine the two. So for those of you who haven't yet tuned in, make sure you give it a listen and let us know what you think. So today we're switching gears and we're going to zoom in on a topic that will be especially interesting for those of you involved in conversion initiatives. So yeah, Luke, maybe you can tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so thanks, Erin, and hi everybody. Today we're going to address an interesting issue that many digital roles relate to, and that is actually implementing an effective experimentation strategy. So we see that brands are increasingly beginning to understand the importance of experimentation and what kind of effect this has on their digital performance. However, creating a culture of experimentation in which failure is actually seen as something to learn from, that can be difficult. So we want to talk today with a well-seasoned conversion expert about how digital enterprises can take a more strategic approach, let's say, to experimentation.
Yeah, that's right. So today's special guest is the founder and managing director of Conversion.com. That's a experimentation agency that optimizes customer experience, product, and pricing for a lot of big names such as Facebook, Domino's, and UNICEF. So let's give a warm welcome to Stephen Pavlovich.
Thank you
Stephen,
very much.
How are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you. Very good. How are you?
Good to hear. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Good. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Luke.
Hey, thanks for taking the time out to have a chat with us today.
Of course.
So, for those who don't know, are you able to kick off by just telling us a bit more about what Conversion does and your role there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're an agency that does experimentation. So often conversion rate optimization, but we take the principles of CRO and we apply them to pretty much anything. So that means that we could be running experiments on customer experience or functionality, new product development, pricing, and so on. But the one thing that unites it all is focusing on experimentation, so using actual data and evidence to inform decision making as opposed to opinion or best practice or copying what your competitors are doing.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks. And again, as I say, thanks for joining us today to take time out for this. But yeah, before we get started, what we always like to do with our guests is is break the ice. So we do have a bit of a quick question for you.
Icebreaker.
Yeah, so our question for you is, due to COVID, a lot of us are sitting at home watching a lot of TV. The weather's getting colder. We're just curious to hear, what show on Netflix have you binge watched embarrassingly fast?
Good question.
Do you have one?
I do. It is probably going to be the same as a lot of other people, The Queen's Gambit, which we just finished watching last night. And the timing was very good because I just taught my 6-year-old boy how to play chess about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
And so the timing was very nice. So not that he's watched it himself, though. He's a little bit young for shows about addiction and stuff like that. Give him a couple of years.
Okay.
It's cool that you taught him how to play chess. That's the perfect lockdown hobby, actually.
Exactly. He seems remarkably interested in it, which is very nice to see.
Awesome.
Nice. I've actually never learned how to play chess. It's too complicated. I was always a checkers kind of person. All right. Well, so we'll go ahead and get started then. The reason we invited you on our show is we want to hear a little bit more about your CRO methodology at Conversion.com.
Yes.
We know a lot of most good projects, they start off with outlining a set of goals, but we want to know, how can organizations specify their goals, and where do they go from there?
Absolutely, it's a really good question. It's obviously the perfect place to start. I think a lot of the time when people are starting out on CRO, on experimentation, they often get kind of so excited by the opportunity to finally change stuff on the website and test their ideas, and show just how right they are, and show the uplift in some of their ideas, that they just go all in with A/B testing, and they start testing lots of random ideas on lots of different parts of the website without really a kind of strict methodology behind it. And the tools and technology make that very easy to do. But I think you're right. Like, we need to start by defining the goals and the KPIs first. And I think a lot of the time people kind of hear that and they think, yeah, of course. I mean, suppose we're an e-commerce website. Our goal is to increase sales, and our KPI is conversion rate. Okay, let's move on. But that's not really the case. Like, we would always challenge that by saying, okay, let's try and define a SMART goal. So if your goal is to increase revenue, how much do you want to increase revenue by, and what's the time scale that you're going to put on that? That will often affect how you approach the experimentation program, how much investment you need, the type of experiments that you need to be running, and how, I guess, aggressive the concepts are. So that's probably a good place to start, by defining that SMART goal. And then moving on from there, you obviously have to look at the KPIs. And again, people can often skip over that, thinking, okay, let's test on the conversion rate. How many people who come to the website end up making a purchase, for example. But even that might be oversimplifying it, because you have to stop and ask yourself the question. Sorry, that's my chair squeaking. You have to stop and ask yourself, are all sales equal? Do we earn higher profit on some products versus others? Often with retail sites, for example, they could have upsells that have a much higher margin than the core product, for example. So you have to say, like, do we care about what people are buying? Are all sales equal? Or actually is what we want to drive gross profit, as opposed to the e-commerce conversion rate, for example? And you can obviously define a few KPIs. I'd urge people not to do more than probably 3 or 4 at most, because the K in KPI stands for key. So you don't want to be don't want to do too much. But then when you've got all of that, that gives you the right kind of framework to then say, okay, we know what our goal is, and we know what we're going to set out and try and achieve. We know how we're going to measure it. Now we need to build a framework around that. So this is the bit where I actually answer the question that you asked me, which is, what do you do once you've got the goal and the KPIs? So assuming that you've got all of that down, you then need to ask yourself a very kind of simple question, which is, okay, if our goal is, suppose that the goal, one of the KPIs is the e-commerce conversion rate, we then have to stop and ask ourselves a very simple question, which is, why did people come to our website and then not buy something? And it sounds super obvious, almost too obvious that you don't need to ask it in the first place. But then when you look at the kind of A/B tests that a lot of companies run, they don't really pass that test. So a lot of the time, even today, people will do stuff like run a lot of A/B tests on button color and the size of the font and the placement of the image, of the product image, for example, and stuff like that. And that's all very well, that might work. But then you have to think, well, is the reason why someone comes to the website and then doesn't buy because the call to action was the wrong color, or the product image was on the right and not the left? If you think about these kind of things logically, you then realize, okay, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe people don't buy because they can't find the product that's right for them, or they don't understand why they should buy it from you and not from a competitor, or they aren't sure about delivery, or there's friction in the checkout process, and so on. So you have to start to build up an understanding of what we call them levers, what those levers are, the things that are stopping people from converting.
Yeah. So is there some sort of process in place to, because it's not, it's also about like the people that are using your product. So
Definitely.
How can you target those personas or visitors?
Yeah, it's a very fair point. So the way that we do it at conversion.com, we will, once we've defined the goals and the KPIs, then we define the audiences. So essentially, who are the different people who are coming to the website? It could be desktop versus mobile, or it could be existing customers and new customers, for example. We want to define all of these different audience segments, not necessarily so that we can target them individually, but so that we're thinking about each of them, we're quantifying the size and the importance of that segment, and then we start to think about how their behavior might be different. So, take a new customer versus a returning customer, for example. A new customer might be much more concerned about things like trust and the returns policy, for example, whereas a returning visitor might have had experience of that before, so would be much more concerned about the friction within the process and how quickly they can place a second order, for example. So we want to define and prioritize the audiences. And actually, I should probably add, and the areas as well. So by areas, we mean the different pages on the website. You don't want to. The last thing you want to do is run an A/B test on a page, then find out this is never going to reach statistical significance. You've always got to calculate the sample size in advance.
So essentially, you use groups. You kind of target groups that are influencing certain KPIs. Then I think.
Yeah, exactly so. So essentially, you've kind of got a choice. You can either say, well, we know what these different audience segments are, so let's target them individually and do something that will appeal just to this audience. Or what's probably a better approach to take on day one and probably for quite a little while after that is to say, what are the things that unite all of these audience segments? What do they have in common? What do they all care about? And how can we use that to drive behavioral change on the website?
Yeah. And I have kind of a separate question. I was reading through an article of yours on conversion.com, and you talked about tactical versus strategic experimentation. I thought that was kind of interesting because I think a lot of companies might be guilty of doing this, that they just change things for the sake of changing them that aren't really connected. These things aren't really connected to each other.
Yeah.
So, for example, changing things because the competitor does so or something like that versus a pre-planned strategy. Is this something that you guys come across frequently? Or?
All the time, yeah. Even with the companies that kind of should know better. It's an easy trap to fall into. I think part of it is everyone gets excited and rightly so about A/B testing and experimentation, but the temptation is you kind of get all of those ideas and you dump them into a spreadsheet, for example, and then you try and prioritize them and you start at the top and work your way down. And it doesn't kind of really work like that in practice. The approach that we take is we will look at the levers that we spoke about a second ago. Take, the delivery or shipping policy, for example. Take something like that and say, we think this is something that our customers care about. Let's run an experiment around it. And if that's successful, then we run another one. And potentially that second one could be a little bit bolder, a bit more ambitious than the first. And then we kind of keep on progressing until essentially we can't squeeze any more out of that lever. So it might be that, we've seen some of our e-commerce clients where we've started testing simple delivery shipping, free shipping or the speed of shipping messaging on the header or in the checkout. And if that works, then we might do it on the product page, and you keep on going and going and going. And then with one client like that, we ended up testing, actually using that principle to improve their commercial strategy. So actually testing same day delivery and things like that, because we knew from our experimentation just how important shipping was to their customers. So you can take something that's a very simple idea and then scale it up. It's a much more strategic approach to take.
Interesting. All right. Well, now we're going to move on to our social media moment.
Social media moment.
And during our social media moment, we like to read off an interesting tweet from another digital enterprise and just get your take on the matter. So Chameleon AI just tweeted about a new blog post they came out with explaining multi-channel experimentation and how it can benefit your business. So in this article, they talk about a key part of multi-channel success is really delivering a personalized, optimized experience that is, seamless, fluid, and also consistent across all digital channels. So our question for you is, with everything we just talked about, does setting up an experimentation strategy look different when applied to different channels? So, for example, web, email, mobile?
It absolutely can do. I think it comes down to that original question. Like if in doubt, just ask yourself, why are people coming to the website and they're not converting? And if the answer to that is different, depending on the channel that people are coming from, then yes, it makes sense to have a different approach. So I think, if you think about, I don't know, let's say someone coming from social media versus an organic search for your brand name versus someone coming from email, for example, they probably all have different requirements. And so it's possible that they will need a different experience to match. But the one thing to bear in mind is that every time you narrow down your audience, every time you focus on a smaller segment, what you're doing is you're making it slightly harder to reach statistical significance typically, because you've obviously got a smaller sample size, you've got less people in the A/B test, and so you might need to have a bigger effect, a bigger uplift to be able to see that. And so often we recommend for a lot of our clients not to think about personalization at the very start of their experimentation program, sometimes not even for a year or longer. Simply because it's much better to have an impact across all of your customers than just focusing on a small segment and getting a good impact just for them.
Yeah, and I had a question as well related to this, a bit more of a practical question, I guess, in a way. Obviously, you talk a bit about A/B testing, but what other tools could be applied to support this strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's obviously the experimentation platforms themselves. So tools like Chameleon and Optimizely and VWO and A/B Tasty and Adobe Target and so on. So you've got all of those platforms to enable the experimentation itself. But then there's a bunch of other stuff that you can use to inform essentially what you test and also how you analyze that data. So at the very minimum, we would obviously need web analytics to understand how people are interacting with the website. But if you can build on that with other sources of quantitative and qualitative data, then that will mean that your experimentation is far more likely to succeed. Again, it all comes down to having an understanding of your customers, what they want, and what's stopping them from converting. And the better you can fix that, the higher your performance is going to be.
Yeah, super. Makes sense. And do you actually have any specific examples that you can share in terms of case studies?
In terms of client case studies?
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we've done. We've been working in this space for getting on for 15 years now, so we've built up quite a lot of case studies in that time. If I give you an example, like with one of our clients, Domino's Pizza, we started with them, I think, almost 4 years ago now. And when we started out working with them, we were doing a lot of work optimizing the checkout the checkout flow itself. As you can imagine, often when people go to Domino's, they are hungry, they want to order a pizza, and it's not that likely that they will drop out with of the funnel. I think they have a good kind of baseline conversion rate. So then the question is, like, do you want to try and make that a little bit higher, or do you focus on AOV, on increasing the amount that people are purchasing? And so we've been working across both of those KPIs for Domino's for the last almost 4 years. And more recently, we've been applying the same principles of experimentation to testing product as well. In other words, if Domino's wanted to launch a new product, suppose they've got 5 ideas for what their next product should be, but they can't choose between them. What we've been doing is running A/B tests to add one of those products, chosen at random, to the menu, so that we can track how many people try to buy that product. So that way we get actual real customer data on product demand without even having to create the product in the first place. And that's been hugely useful to get much more accurate insight and much faster too.
Interesting stuff. Cool.
Well, it looks like we have a little bit more time left, so I guess we can ask you a couple more questions. You've outlined pretty much how you can set up the framework for experimentation with your goals, your KPIs, the different channels, tools you can use for this. But once you've done that, what happens next? So you have different steps, but how do you prioritize them?
Yes, it's a really good point. I think prioritization is one of the most important but overlooked aspects of conversion optimization, because essentially, like, anybody can run an A/B test, but because when you run an experiment, you have to track it through to statistical significance, it means that there can be a limitation on the number of experiments that you can run. So you might have a ton of ideas that you want to test, but you can only run a very small amount of them. So that means prioritization is going to be super important. The first thing that you need to do is define the framework that we talked about at the start. Then I think a lot of the ways that people fall over in this area is that they try to prioritize with a really subjective methodology. So they might ask, okay, let's take this idea that we had for an experiment and let's try and estimate how impactful is this experiment going to be. Is it a 10 out of 10 or is it a 5 out of 10 or is it a 2 out of 10? And the problem is that that's really subjective. Like if you're not putting any data to inform that rating, then it's pretty arbitrary. And what tends to happen is if you've got 6 people sitting around a table and you've all shared different ideas to test, then people tend to vote much more highly in favor of their own ideas. So it becomes a bit of a futile exercise. The approach that we take at Conversion is to use our score methodology, which we go into quite a lot of detail on our blog. But with that approach, we use data, not opinion, to inform our prioritization. So when you build out that framework, when you're looking at the areas on the website, the homepage, the product page, the listing page, and so on, you should start to prioritize the areas as well. So what is the opportunity to drive revenue increase across each of those pages? So you can start to use data to inform that, but you can also use data to inform the levers as well. So if you have, the examples of trust versus shipping versus friction in the checkout flow, for example, you can gather data from user testing, from surveys to see essentially how often are these points cited as a reason why people are not converting. You can use that data to inform an estimation. And then that your prioritization should improve over time, because obviously the more A/B tests that you run, the more you'll be able to understand, okay, we've got an 80% win rate on this lever. So 4 out of 5 tests that we run on this lever are successful, but on that one, only 1 out of 5 is. We've only got a 20% win rate. So therefore, we should be prioritizing the format. So that way you can start to build out a much more objective approach to prioritizing your experiments using data, not opinion.
Yeah, so it's really all about the data.
Always, yes.
Always. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So, Stephen, we want to thank you again for your time and for joining us on the show.
Of course, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yes, and just to end the podcast, I want to know if there's any last bit of advice that you have to give to our listeners about conversion and experimentation.
So, actually, there are 9 kind of key principles of experimentation that we've put together at conversion.com. So we can probably include or share a link, but if you search for 9 principles of experimentation, that should hopefully come up. But one of the key ones that we see a lot of people making, one of the key mistakes that we see a lot of people making that we haven't talked about today, is the idea of having one kind of provable idea per experiment. So what I mean by that is, if you're running an A/B test, often the temptation is, okay, we're testing this really good idea, but while we're doing that, what if we did X, Y, and Z as well? What if we change these other things on this page that have been bugging us that we really wanted to fix? The problem with that, obviously, is if you start to mix up lots of different ideas, lots of different hypotheses into one experiment, if that A/B test then wins or loses, you don't really know why. And it becomes very hard to maintain that strategic approach to experimentation. So as far as possible, we'd always recommend doing the boldest experiment that you can on one single hypothesis.
Oh, that's a good piece of advice. Well, that's it for today's podcast, and hopefully this has given all of our listeners a lot to think about when it comes to starting up your own experimentation program. And bottom line, really, it's all about the data. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and we're looking forward to bringing you much more exciting content here on 360 Digital. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in for a brand new episode next month.